Morning everybody, welcome to Indycar on Monday morning. My name's Gordon Ross today. I'm in Maryhill and I wanted to talk to you about a single subject this morning, which is the newspaper headline from the Telegraph over the weekend, which claimed rather dramatically that the SNP was going to ruin Brexit just by demanding its powers back from Brussels. Now, is it possible for Scotland to ruin Brexit? Well, no, it's not. Of course it isn't. Scotland has, what, 35 MPs at Westminster to something like over 500 English MPs. There's no way on earth that Scotland could do anything to ruin Brexit. But what's the problem with these powers? Well, it seems that despite a meeting to try and thrash out the business of which powers should come back to Scotland and which should be kept by Westminster, that Mike Russell, who was arguing the case for Scotland at the weekend with David Davis, has actually managed to secure somewhere in the region of 86 of these powers back to Scotland. There's still about 25 of these powers which the British government claims it wants to keep. So there is still an impasse over these 111 plus so-called powers coming back from the European Union. Now, I've read in detail what these powers actually consist of, and most of it is very fine details over the management of things like farming, agricultural chemicals, the environment, looking after the water quality, and a lot of it is very fine detail about things which would only concern Scotland and which are definitely not reserved matters. So why is the British government so desperately keen that we don't get these powers? Well, one of the reasons is that some of these powers work on areas of Scottish legislation which concern the environment particularly. So we're talking about things like chemicals, pollution, the pollution of water courses, the cleanliness of things like rivers and water courses, the preservation of wildlife and wild places, and the control of substances used in agriculture like pesticides and herbicides, and other types of chemicals and medications used on things like farm animals. So there are a huge number of smaller powers which don't seem to directly have any great weight when it comes to political power in Scotland. But the reason that the British government doesn't want us to have them, I suspect, is because they are something which is helping to prevent things like hydraulic fracturing. Because the Scottish government has not banned fracking, but what it has done is it's put in place a permanent moratorium. In other words, it's put in place a restriction which says that forever, without end, the fracking companies who wish to drill into the Scottish ground for oil and gas below the surface have to prove beyond any scientific doubt that the processes they use control the risks of pollution to the environment and ensure the safety of the process. And the problem is, sorry, just got a little message that's come across my screen, I'll answer it in a minute. The problem with this is, for companies like Ineos, is that if the Scottish government controls these powers over the environment, then the ban on fracking will likely remain in place indefinitely. And so it seems obvious to me, at least, and it must be obvious to anybody who watches this show, that powers over the environmental controls in Scotland, if they fell back into Westminster's hands and were taken away from the Scottish government, would allow the frackers to get in there and have these rules relaxed. And this is, I think, one of the primary reasons why the Scottish government is having such a battle to get some of these powers back. Now, I haven't heard which of the powers haven't been returned. I know that 25 of them are still disputed by the British government. And I would suspect that those 25 will be the ones which are directly linked to SEPA, to the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency's powers over things like industrial processes, drilling into the ground, the possible pollution of groundwater, the possible release of chemicals into the air, the possible damage to roads caused by excessive truck movements of tankers coming in to take out oil and gas from these fracking sites. So there's a lot in this, and I suspect that the reasons that the British government is now trying to blame Scotland for ruining Brexit is to try and cast the blame for the Brexit mess onto the Scots, who are really just trying to protect Scotland from fracking. And I have to say, at the moment, quite successfully protecting Scotland from fracking. We know now that Ineos has been given permission by a judge to challenge the imposition of this not a ban, it's a moratorium that the Scottish Government imposed on fracking and on other methods of extracting gas in unconventional ways from beneath the surface of the land. But the point is that these measures that the Scottish Government has put in place can only be challenged if Ineos challenged the Scottish Government's right to actually impose the restriction. They cannot argue with the science of it, and so rather than trying to prove that their process is clean, which they can't because it's filthy and pollutes the land, they know it does, and there's evidence all over the world for that, instead of going down that road, they're going to the legal lengths of trying to prove that the Scottish Government is not the competent authority to impose such a ban. And if they do that, then it would fall back to the Supreme Court in London to say the Scottish Government is not competent to make such a ban stick, and therefore the English Parliament would then have the final say, and of course the Tories would force through fracking. Now, forcing through fracking is not just a distant possibility. If Ineos is successful in this bid to have the fracking moratorium effectively quashed because it was not a legislation which was competent to the Scottish Government. If that is successful, then the Tories will force fracking to go ahead all over Scotland, all over the Central Belt, all around Edinburgh, all around Stirling, Glasgow, the Central Lowlands, all the way up the east coast towards Aberdeen. Anywhere where there is a licence to frack at the moment, Ineos and Quadrilla will be in there drilling hundreds of wells as soon as the Tories give them the green light. And this, to me, is one of the most clear and present dangers to the Scottish landscape that we've ever had. It's the biggest threat to Scotland's clean water, to its whisky industry, its brewing industry, its food industries. All of these industries rely on clean groundwater pumped up from aquifers below the surface where the water is completely pure at the moment. But once you start fracturing the rocks below these aquifers, and gases and oils and chemicals from the fracturing mud and the fracturing liquid start to seep in, all of that groundwater could be completely contaminated with hydrocarbons, with gases. We could have water which you could set fire to. There'll be rivers that you can light. This has already happened. These aren't scare stories. These are not fake news. These are issues which have affected thousands of communities across the United States, where hundreds of thousands of wells have been drilled all over the United States without any thought for the environment whatsoever. And we've seen the damage that this causes. Now, if you are a person who lives in the Central Belt and you have been swithering about whether to support independence or to stay with the UK and go with Brexit, remember that staying with the UK and Brexit means fracking, and it's a certainty for fracking, because as soon as Ineos wins this particular legal challenge, and remember they have billions of pounds to back them up, the Scottish Government will not want to fight a very expensive legal battle against a massive drilling company for months and months and months. They won't be able to do it. It would waste public money. They won't be able to defend it for very long. And so it seems that within a few months, fracking could be a reality again. And only by voting for independence can you guarantee that fracking will not happen. Anyway, I have to go. I've got messages coming in today from all over the place, so I'll speak to you later. But just remember, fracking now is a clear and present danger, so let's not mess around. Let's vote yes. Let's get out of the UK before the whole country is fracked.